Chapter 10, Boy at the Back of the Class, War and the Missing Pieces. On the day after the big fight, just as Tom had guessed, Armit became famous. In the playground, wherever he went, people pointed and gasped and called him the boy who beat Brendan the bully. And they asked him lots of questions like, is it true you can do 100 punches in 1 minute? And what were you really fighting over? Was it your parents' ransom money? When are you going to fight again? Can we come and watch? Okay, now this is kind of glamorizing fighting, and I think you guys know that that's absolutely not okay. This is a particular situation, okay? And also it's a storybook, but you know, teachers would get involved. After a while, Miss Hempsey began to tell everyone to leave Armit alone. Oh, there she's getting involved. So everyone started asking Michael, Josie, and Tom and me their questions instead. I didn't say much, and neither did Michael. But Josie and Tom got so excited that they started to add new bits to the story, so that by the end of the week, most of the school believed Armit had just beaten up Brendan the bully, and had also beat Chris and Liam too over a suitcase full of real diamonds and a pink basketball. Actually, it was the pomegranate. Gosh, stories can get out of proportion. All of this is why you don't repeat things you hear, because usually they're wrong. All of this made Brendan the bully scowl more than ever. But even though he stared at us all the time, and Chris and Liam showed us their fists whenever they saw us, they didn't chase us around the playground, or steal Josie's football, or smash into us when we were carrying our lunch trays, like we thought they would. I bet he's scared of us now that we've got Armit, grinned Tom. Yeah, said Josie, he's a proper scaredy cat now. But Michael said he didn't like it one little bit, and that he bet Brendan the bully was up to something. At first I didn't believe him, and then lots of strange things began to happen to Armit. Ah, right. The first thing happened just 2 days after the big fight. When we were all decorating a new pot for our photosynthesis plants, Mrs. Khan had given Armit a golden star, because his plant had grown the fastest than anyone else's. I think this was because every morning, before Mrs. Khan called the register, he'd water it and talk to it for a whole minute. I didn't know that plants could speak different languages, but when I asked Mrs. Khan about it, she said plants could speak every language under the sun, and that the more languages they heard, the faster they grew. Some people believe it's because you're breathing out carbon dioxide as you're talking to it, you're breathing in oxygen. Well, you could do some research. Armit was really proud of his golden star, and he got a silver one too for decorating his pot with pictures of seashells and whales and fish. But when we got back from last break that afternoon, his pot was lying broken on the floor. And his plant had been stamped on. Someone must have smashed it on purpose, because nobody else's plant pots were hurt at all. Mrs. Khan said that if the person who did it didn't put their hand up right away, they would be in big trouble. But nobody did put their hands up, so the mystery of the murdered pot plant stayed a mystery. Then, almost exactly a week after the mystery of the murdered pot plant, came the day of the deathly worm tray. These are all with capital letters, like names of titles of stories. After assembly one morning, Mrs. Khan told us all to get our workbooks from our class trays. That's like you've got boxes, they have trays. But when Armit pulled his open, he found it bursting with a whole pile of large, fat, wriggling worms. He cried out, dropped the tray on the floor, and so that all the worms went flying across the room. They made Dean, who sits on the table behind me, be sick all over his table. Dean is scared of anything that doesn't have legs on it, even snails, but he hates worms the most. Mr. Whittaker, the school cleaner, had to come in and help clean it all up. And Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Hempsey were very angry and checked all our trays. But no one else had a single worm, not even Tony the nose picker, and who likes to collect all strange things in his tray. Mrs. Khan again told the person who's done it to put their hand up. And this time she looked at Brendan the bully as if she wasn't really speaking to anyone, only to him. I do that sometimes. But again, nobody put their hand up, so Mrs. Khan shook her head and said she was going to make sure that whoever it was would be caught and punished, not just by her, but by Mr. Sanders too, Mrs. Sanders too. Then after that came the worst trick of all. The one that everyone in school later called the Great Baked Beans Bag Trap. Every morning, right before Mrs. Carnes takes the register, everyone has to put their school bag on its own special hook in the back of the class, and we're only allowed to take our PE kit or homework or lunch boxes out when we're told to. Everyone knows whose bag is where, and because everyone's hook has their name on it too. Just days after the day of the deathly worm tray, Mrs. Carnes told us to get up and collect our PE kits from our bags like she always did on Wednesdays. When Amit went to get his PE kit and unzipped his rucksack, a lumpy river of baked beans burst out. Just like and splodged and splashed all over him. Everyone cried, "Ooh," and then instantly fell silent. Mrs. Carnes was so angry when no one put their hand up that she cancelled PE. And Mrs. Sanders was called and told the whole class off. It was horrible, especially because Amit started to cry when he saw what had happened to his PE kit and his bag. Remembering as a refugee, he doesn't have a lot. His parents are not even with him. So to his bag and things are incredibly precious. I hope they get together and get him a new one. I think everyone knew it was Brendan the bully who had done all these things, but no one could prove it, not even Mrs. Carnes. After that day, the door to the classroom was locked every break time and at lunchtime, which stopped anything else from happening to Amit's things. But I wanted more than anything for Brendan the bully to be caught and to prove he was a criminal. So Michael brought his granddad's magnifying glass in and we all searched for clues. We couldn't find a single one, not even in the school bins. Yeah, you'd think you'd see the cans from the baked beans. Amit was more upset about the Great Baked Bean Bag Trap than any of the other things that had happened, and even though Miss Hemsey washed his rucksack with lots of washing up liquid, it looked even worse than before and smelled strange too. But Amit still brought it to school every day. I wanted to know why he didn't get a new one, or why Miss Hemsey kept saying that it looked fine when it didn't. And then, just 2 days after the Great Beanbag Trap, I found out. Okay, turn and talk. What do you think is the reason he didn't get the new bag? We had all put away our books and were getting ready for group story time, like we always did on Fridays when Mrs. Carnes made a surprise announcement. "Now everyone," she said, "this is our last afternoon before we break up for the half-term holidays." And I thought we could do with a treat. Instead of us all reading a story together, we're going to listen to one instead. And it's a very important story because it's going to be told to us by somebody very special in our class. Looking over at Amit and Mrs. Hemsey, she waved them over to where she was standing. I didn't know it just then, but I was about to have nearly all of my original 11 questions answered in one go. They're going to do kind of a kids up front. We all turned around to watch as Mrs. Hemsey picked up a large pile of papers from the table and followed Amit to the front of the class. I want everyone to listen carefully, and I don't want anyone asking any questions until after Amit's finished telling his story. Is that understood? I want yes, Mrs. Carnes. Good. Amit? Everyone shuffled in their chairs and sat straight up waiting for Amit to speak. I wondered if he'd tell his story in English or in Kurdish, but I was so excited I didn't really care. "Hello, my name is Amit. I am 9 years old and I am a refugee from Syria." As he said this, he pointed to Mrs. Hemsey, who held up a drawing showing a house and a tree and a car in the front of some mountains. And in the front of the car were 4 people, and the picture was labelled me, Mum, Dad, Sister, and Cat. This was the drawing. I was surprised because I'd never thought about Amit having a brother or a sister. I thought he was like me and didn't have any. His sister wasn't at our school, and in the picture she looked smaller than him, so maybe she was in the nursery. "But in Syria there's a big war," said Amit. He pointed to Mrs. Hemsey again, who held up another picture. This one was showing buildings on fire and bombs dropping from planes and lots of people lying on the ground and other people holding guns. It looked like this. Now, I remember this war. I remember the war in Syria. Josie stopped chewing her hair and looked at me and then looked back at the drawing again. And from behind her, I heard somebody whisper, "Whoa, he's seen a real bomb and a real gun?" Because of war and my family, run away, said Amit with his lion eyes big and round and watery. We went mountains, rivers, carry bag, and cat. This time Mrs. Hemsey held up a picture showing a family crossing the mountains and rivers, and in the sky birds were crying. Birds that were crying. Birds. That's a good image, isn't it? In the picture, Amit had drawn himself carrying a red rucksack with a big black stripe on it, just like the one he had now. Oh, maybe that rucksack is the only thing he's got from Syria and that his parents gave him. That was when I knew why he loved it so much and why he cried when it had been filled with Brendan the bully's horrible baked beans. He'd carried it all the way from his house over the mountains, which meant it was lots more important and lots more special than our bags. This was the picture. Then, nowhere safe to go. Big boat, sea. This time Mrs. Hemsey handed a drawing of a boat, but the boat wasn't like a normal boat with sails and pointy ends and wooden sides. This one was flat and round and was orange on the sides, just like the ones I had seen on the news that didn't have any toilets on them. And inside the boat were lots of people, all wearing vests that were made to look like puffin birds. But there were people in the water too, and they had bubbles coming out of their mouths, saying, "Help me." Everyone leaned forward in their chairs and tried to read the labels Amit had put over some of the people's heads. They saw me, Mum, and Dad. There wasn't one for sister or cat. I know cats don't like water because Josie has a cat. She said it screams whenever it rains and always wants to stay inside. So maybe Amit's cat didn't want to go on the boat, and maybe his sister didn't want to leave it behind, so she stayed back to look after it. This was the boat picture. Then we in another country, Greece, said Amit. We live in tent with lots of people. Who run away. Me like. They come from lots of country, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Eritrea. The next picture showed a flag with blue and white stripes and white cross in a blue corner, and next to it were lots of tents and people everywhere sitting next to fires and sleeping on the floor. And in this picture, only the words Dad and me could be seen. Amit's mum must have been sleeping in the tents. What do you think? Do you think the sister wanted to stay behind and look after the cats, and did you think Mum's sleeping in the tents? Maybe turn and talk. Then we walked long time in lots of country. It was cold, we sleep on floor. And then we stay in France. There's a big refugee camp in France. This time Amit pointed to the next picture with his finger and showed us the railway tracks he had drawn. On it were people carrying suitcases and children, and all of them were walking to a wall with barbed wire on the top. Everyone looked sad, and in the corner there were army tanks and soldiers holding guns, and all the guns were pointing at the people with the suitcases and the children. Mrs. Hemsey held this drawing up for longer than any of the others because Amit was looking at it and didn't seem to want to stop staring at it. This was the drawing. Okay, we're going to stop here. It is halfway through a chapter and we're on page 112 for those following along.